Hi, welcome to Sustain Talks, the podcast crafted to enlighten individuals and businesses on the path to becoming more sustainable and socially responsible. I'm Sam Candy, CEO of Responsible Futures, where we support businesses through consulting, training, webinars, and masterclasses. Today, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Archie Ruggles-Brise. He's an independent rural estate manager and environmental professional, co-founder and chair of North Essex Farm Cluster, partner at Spain's Hall Estate, and chair of the board of trustees of Essex and Suffolk Rivers Trust. A lot. I am looking forward to getting into a conversation about biodiversity net gain, agroforestry, nature, natural flood management, and so much more. Archie, it's so good to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Sam. It's brilliant to be here.
Good. Right. So, I mean, that was a brief introduction, but actually, it'd be great if you could tell us a bit about your background and how you became involved in the field of agroforestry and rural estate management.
Yeah, sure. It's been a bit of a winding journey. So I started off my career in the water industry, did a biology degree, went into the water industry for a brief time, and then started in the NGO world. So I stepped out of the kind of corporate world into the NGO world, and I spent a good few years working for and setting up charities, UK-based charities called the Rivers Trusts. Did a bit of central policy work for them, helped drive sort of grants and the approach towards what we call a catchment-based approach. This is kind of a landscape scale conservation land, all working with private landowners or not owned land. And then I started doing that on my own land as well. So this is my family estate, family farm in North Essex. So we've got about 830 hectares under ownership here, just north of Stansted Airport. So with a lot of the aeroplanes fly over us as they come in. Quite nicely connected near to Cambridge and a lot of the commuter belts in Chelmsford and Colchester as well. So we're sort of just outside London, but sort of within touching distance. And what we're doing at the moment is shifting about half of the land area of the estate from kind of conventional agriculture to something that really balances nature and environmental risk much more, much on a much more equal footing to food production. So we're trying to sort of put things back in balance a little bit.
Can you explain how agroforestry contributes to farming, particularly in terms of promoting sustainability and biodiversity?
Yeah, it's a great question because agroforestry brings diversity into a system that isn't really renowned for its diversity. Normally you get one thing going on in a field and that's your kind of main output from it, and that sort of is done to the exclusion of everything else. The beauty of agroforestry is the moment you plant some trees or you bring something else into the system is you've got more than one thing going on in the field, and you're then taking a step towards diversity. In our case, what it's allowing us to do is it's de-intensifying our land use even further. So it's deriving the value from the crop that's coming off that tree, so the nuts. That's the thing we're going to sell, but obviously we don't have to rip those trees up and plant them every year. So those trees stay there for many years, their roots penetrate the ground, they improve the soil, and then the area around them becomes habitat for everything else.
Yeah,
So it's about diversity, really.
yeah, and you must have seen so many more animals coming out and living off the land too.
Do you know what? It's really interesting. We're still quite early stage at the process. We've just finished planting out our 6,000 agroforestry trees in the last few weeks. But even before that, when we took the intensive arable production, intensive crop production off a lot of the fields, and it sort of sat there for about 9 months before we got going with establishing the kind of habitats for wildlife. Even just the fact that we weren't cultivating it meant that we had loads and loads of stuff on the fields. We had loads of hares, we had loads of birds, we had flocks of things like goldfinches, which are called a charm, by the way, something I learned. But you just, the whole place just sort of, certainly in certain fields, just started to come alive.
Wow, yeah, it's I love being out and seeing the nature and the wildlife and waking up, especially now. Can you speak a little bit more? I love wilding. I love when I go anywhere and I see just natural wilding. Can you elaborate on that, what that means and how it intersects with agroforestry and environmental stewardship?
Yeah, so in our world, we think of wilding as a more of a sort of stepped back approach. So, if you take one extreme, farming um, is a very active, very management led approach. You've got to do an awful lot to it. Countryside stewardship, which is an agri-environment scheme, so basically a government grant scheme, which is common in the UK, and there are similar ones around Europe and elsewhere. They tend to pay you to do things for nature. So again, it's quite an active process, and some of those habitats are then rotated every year. So you'll still cultivate them, but you'll put them somewhere else, and that fits in with a sort of rotational cropping system. So that's a little bit less intense, but still quite management heavy. Then you've got the biodiversity net gain areas. They are much more of a we're dedicating these areas to long-term 30 plus years of habitat creation. So some of that can be quite active in the early days, and then it's a maintenance activity. So you have to sow your grass mix, and then you have to maintain it for 30 years. And then the wilding bit is, for us, it's where we've put our beavers. So we're using beavers as natural flood management tools, and we can't tell them what to do. They do whatever they want to do within the area that we set aside from them. To me, that's the sort of wilding element of it. We know they're going to be beneficial, but we've got absolutely no control over what they do, aside from the fact that they're in a fence. So that's the kind of, well, we're just going to let them get on with it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Really lovely. I want to talk a little bit about carbon removal, and especially here in the UK. Do the woodlands in the UK, what role do they play towards this process?
That's a really interesting question. So in the UK, we've got a standard called the Woodland Carbon Code. We've also got another one, the Peatland Carbon Code. So those are the only two kind of authorized standards within the UK. And they're all built around creating new woodland. So if you're planting new woodland, which we're doing, so we're got plans to plant about 25 hectares of new woodland in and around the existing ones, you can then generate carbon credits over those, because the sequestration rates from new trees are mapped out. And that's great. So those would be available for people to buy if they wish in the voluntary carbon market. What's interesting is that in the UK, we also have quite a lot of existing woodland. And those woodlands are really valuable if they're managed properly and they're kept healthy and they're kept productive. So you get lots of regeneration of trees and things. They can actually sequester quite a lot of carbon as well. The issue with it is that there's no standard over them. So, anybody, any corporate that's looking to buy carbon will only really be faced with woodland creation carbon, not woodland maintenance carbon. So that's an interesting challenge for maintaining those existing assets, those existing nature habitats, rather than just always creating new ones. Both of them are valid, but there's no financial support to do the maintenance ones through the carbon markets anyway.
And I guess with the new ones, it can take 30 years until till anything happens. So really investing in the woodlands that we have and supporting the nature that we have and improving on that is going to be important to do, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the new woodlands, you don't generate verified carbon units for the first 5 years for obvious reasons. You put a very small tree in the ground. You can generate what's called pending issuance units, which is sort of upfront a guesstimate as to how much carbon that's going to sequester, but then you get it verified at year 5, and then at 10 and 15, 20, 30. And actually woodland creation in the UK, I think the carbon models are based around 100 years. And under legislation in the UK, if you plant a new woodland, it's very, very hard to remove it again. So that means that's how you achieve your permanence. But it would be really interesting within a kind of voluntary environment to explore more around how might be a sort of nature gain to be had from managing existing woodlands, because the Forestry Commission, who are the sort of woodland regulator in the UK, are constantly telling us that our existing woodlands, of which there's about 13% of the UK is covered in woodlands, are undermanaged and they're in poor condition. They're actually declining. So they're declining in terms of how much there is, but also just the quality of it. So we desperately need to do something about that. So it's a really interesting conversation amongst your audience and your clients to understand what the motivators might be to enable that, because you'd be pushing an open door in sort of domestic UK based conservation efforts if there was a solution to channeling funds into that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. You mentioned earlier biodiversity net gain, and I said in the beginning that we were going to speak about it. It's a term that is, I mean, the terms change from year to year to year, but it is a term that is gaining more attention in environmental discussions. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how and what the benefits are, and what is
So
it?
yeah, of course I can. Yeah. So biodiversity net gain is a specific term built around a UK legislative instrument. So we've got the Environment Act in the UK, which was put onto the statute books in 2021. And under that, every development, so anyone who builds anything and goes for planning permission in the UK, which is the sort of, the control mechanism for new buildings, extensions, infrastructure projects, has to apply for planning permission. And through that process, they now have to guarantee that their development will achieve 100% plus another 10% of biodiversity gain. So that's where biodiversity net gain, that's where the term comes from. It's a specific thing in the UK. If they can't do that on site, within their red line boundary, then they can go locally or they can go nationally to buy offsets for that. So there's a market in offsets being created in the UK through that particular regulatory driver. And if you're providing an offset like we are, then you have to guarantee that that habitat will be maintained and enhanced for 30 years. So it's a long-term commitment.
That really is great to hear. Yeah.
It's a fantastic opportunity for those areas on farms, and there are always areas on farms that aren't great for growing food. They've perhaps been brought into production because of previous regulations, drives for maximum production, which is what we saw from the sort of mid 40s to the mid 70s. And we're trying to use this, and others are trying to use this to try and take those areas back out, sort of put them back to what they should be. So that's under the mandatory system, but then there's a sort of parallel voluntary biodiversity. So it's not biodiversity net gain, it's just biodiversity offsetting. And you can do that with a similar kind of approach. And the beauty with the UK is that because we've got this mandatory regulatory framework, it's actually quite easy to assess the biodiversity uplift of a particular project. And you could potentially purchase it on a voluntary basis and then flip it into the mandatory system. If your supply chain or your operations demand an offset, you could already have that offset, and you could then deploy it at a later date.
Yeah. So if you're assessing it, so for a company, if they, they obviously want reports and they want to be able to see what they're investing in, you can actually assess it and send them reports and they can see the changes.
Absolutely, that's what we do. So every deal that we do around biodiversity, includes the reporting, and if there are specific elements to a corporate reporting as opposed to a kind of mandatory reporting, say if there are additional things, then we can build those in, we can price those in. So if, for example, you want to understand a bit more about the sort of carbon status underneath the biodiversity things, you can't market that, you can't monetize that, but we can certainly try and record it. Do you want to do a bit more around sort of customer engagement? We can do that. We can provide content to engage through your supply chain, so your B2C type operations and all sorts of things. And we can bring staff out for away days, and there's a load of kind of really tangible through to the more sort of intangible well-being things that we can do in the UK.
Yeah, and that's what I love. I love that tangible aspect that you can bring teams and they can actually see it and feel it and volunteer for the day as well, I guess.
Absolutely. And it's what's really nice for us is, unlike having to go to other parts of the world, if you're headquartered in London, for example, and you bought something in the South America, you're unlikely to ever get out there and see it. So you're going to be reliant on kind of secondary content and collateral to be able to kind of assess it. Whereas here, hop on a train, get on a bus, come out and see us. We're here, we know where we are, and we really like seeing people. So we do tours. We show around 5,000 people around a year, which is, sorry, 500 people, I should say. 5,000 would be lovely. 500 people a year, looking at all the aspects of the work we do. So, it's great from our perspective to have that connection as well.
Yeah, I'd definitely love to come along. I was looking at your website and it looks beautiful, and the photography and the courses that you run. So it's definitely gonna go on the list of days out for me. Another area that I really wanted to speak about, and anyone that is living in the UK and listening to this will understand about the floods that we've been having. And I don't think that I've ever seen them as bad as they are, where around the area that I live in, Essex, the roads have been closed. It's causing so much damage to the roads. But flood risk reduction is another area that agroforestry practices can help. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and basically any kind of land use that slows the water down, allows the rain more time to get into the soil, so infiltrate into the soil. That's best done when you've got a cover of vegetation or trees. That's all beneficial for when you've got flood events happening or storm events happening. So anything that slows the water down. In the UK, this is against the context that most land, so 70% of the UK is farmed, and a good proportion of that is actually drained. So historically, we've had a problem as farmers with too much water. So you've got too much water, what do? You drain it. We do this as a society. We quite like to, build channels and pipes and make our rivers flow nice and fast, get rid of the water. And that's still the case in some areas. So, in built up areas, urban areas, you need to get the water away, but you've got to think about where that water's going. And for us, because we sit upstream of a community, if we shoot all the water out too quickly, then it impacts our local community, it impacts the infrastructure, it impacts people's properties. So what we've tried to do is take a completely different approach, which is slowing the water down. So the agroforestry trees do that, the biodiversity net gain areas do that, the new woodlands do that, and then the beavers with their dams and wetlands are the kind of last bit. So all the water comes slowly off the land and then it goes into the beaver wetlands. They slow it down, and essentially it means that we never get, well, we shouldn't get quite as much flooding in our local village as we do. It's What's equally interesting is the other end of the coin. So we're all sitting here um, in sort of late winter, early spring, depending on how you want to look at it. It's probably not very spring-like at the moment. And we're talking about too much water, and everyone's going, the potholes and all this kind of stuff. It's terrible. I've got flooding on the road, can't get around. 2 or 3 months' time, we're going to be talking about too little water. And this
Yeah.
happens a lot. So we had a study done by Atkins looking at basically how do we put too much water and too little water together in a farm context. And we've worked out that actually all the things we're doing, all the nature-based approaches we're doing, have a benefit both when there's too much water, so it slows it down and traps it, but then it slowly releases it. So we've got too little water, we can actually help support the wildlife and the biodiversity by making sure there is more water in the rivers, and also there's more water available for the habitats that we've created. So, just to give you a figure, if we were a reservoir, so all the water that we stored, if we were a reservoir, we would be the 100th biggest reservoir in the country. We've got 5.5 to 8.5 thousand million litres worth of storage on the estate. And that's just a bonkers amount. So if you go and sort of see a reservoir and go and do windsurfing or paddleboarding or whatever it is on it, we are storing a similar amount of water on the estate, we could do. And that then means that we reduce flood risk by up to 30% to our local community, which is a huge amount. And we can add an extra 5 or 10% of low summer flow. So in our context, that means there might be some water in the rivers because of what we're doing in the summer, whereas previously they would have dried up completely, and all the things that live in them and all the people that drink the water out of them struggle with that.
Yeah, my local reservoir, the last few weeks was completely flooded. I couldn't. Normally I walk around the reservoir, and I couldn't walk there. There's a local wild swimming club. They had to close, completely flooded. So that, you do wonder how it can't just be like pulled out and stored, and then stored for the summer so that we can then use that water. That would just be the best solution, right?
It is. And for all of your customers, they'll be thinking about water as a resource. Anything you pay for, you look at as a resource.
Yeah.
The issue with flood water is you generally only pay for the the disbenefits of it. You don't see the value of it. So what we're trying to do is look at it in a different way and go, actually, do you know what? This water has value in the same way that you have to pay your water bill. This water that water that is flooding the reservoir near you, and there's too much water around. If we could trap that, it does have an actual value. And in the summer, you can realize that value either from the fact that you don't have hosepipe bans, or the environment isn't being negatively impacted, or you can still do your wild swimming because there is more water around.
Yeah. Another important, and it's why I do this podcast, is about education and being able to educate as many people into what is going on around the environment and how we can be more sustainable. Do you think that there is more effort that needs to be made to educate the people, but also to educate farmers on land and landowners about these different practices?
Yeah, it's always a learning journey. I've looked around the world and had the opportunity to kind of, pick up some ideas which I've brought back and put together. And I think that space to think is quite difficult. Anyone who's got a tough full-time job, particularly in a small business, knows that the time to sort of step back and just think about stuff is always pretty rare. So I think that's the main thing. The other thing is that the most of these businesses are built around cash flow. So there are only so many ways that you can make money on farms, and generally farms don't make a huge amount of money, not on a sort of average basis. So if we start valuing some of these things that you don't have to remove and sell, so if we do value things like clean water, like landscape value, like pollination value, then it gives them another reason to think about it. So it's the same for any business. Trying to value things like mental health and well-being is really difficult. It's the same on a farm. It's trying to make that link between, we know there's value there, we know it's a good thing to do, we know, but actually at the end of the day, I've got to pay my electricity bill. Does mental health and well-being, good mental health and well-being, directly help me pay the electricity bill? Probably not. But does the fact that your employees are happy, they're happy in their jobs, they're well resourced, they stay for longer, are you saving money because of that? Are they more productive because of that? Which will then help you generate more revenue to pay your electricity bill. But it's exactly the same. Farms are businesses at the end of the day, so they think in exactly the same way as other businesses. And I think there's a lot that we can do cross sector to be able to try and raise that awareness, because I do think agriculture is probably a little bit behind in terms of thinking more widely around some of these aspects that will be second nature to people that you talk to every day.
Yeah, I just think there's such a match there. If you take a corporate business and match them with a farm, and certainly a local farm where they're doing business, they can give so much back to each other. It just seems like the perfect collaboration and partnership. They're doing something good, they're supporting nature, they can share that story, they can offer their employees volunteer days and empower their employees, and you talk about mental health, all of that helps. So there really seems to be, we have all of these farms in the UK, we match the corporates with the farmers or landowners, then we could do so much more, couldn't we?
Oh, completely. And I think there's a huge number of farmers out there, and some of the ones that are members of our farm cluster, are well up for stuff like that. They're really engaged, they really want to talk to people. But there is also a section of farmers who are much less confident in that regard, and much less able to, or much less they're a bit scared by kind of engaging with people as well. So there is another aspect to this, is find the ones that are properly engaged, and let's kind of do that with them. But also let's work out how is it that we can reward those ones who, maybe they're not good at public speaking, maybe they're not, not everybody is a tour guide, for example. So how do we build a system that helps them do the same good things without necessarily requiring them to be shouting about it all over TikTok?
Yeah. So what would be your advice to those farmers, landowners who are thinking about integrating this into their operations?
I think it's just that, is think about it, talk to people that have done it, join a farm cluster if you've got one near you. Talk to other organisations that are, there's loads of, we're very well supplied in the UK for kind of NGOs and charities that are actively wanting to engage with people. But also then just talk to your local businesses, because as you've just said, there
Yeah,
will almost certainly be somebody out there who has an interest in something that you didn't know they had. So
yeah,
make a bit of space for those conversations, and don't worry necessarily if 99% of those conversations are completely abortive. But yeah, so I think it's an exciting time, really exciting
yeah.
time.
I do too. And I think that more people have opened their eyes to nature and protecting nature and getting involved in nature. And what we said earlier, that tangible, being able to see it locally so that you feel like you're doing something, so that you've planted a tree in your own area, so that you've supported the wilding in your own area to support biodiversity. Really, really think there's a connection there that needs to be advanced. Finally, what's next? What are there any big projects that you want to share, or anything exciting that you want to talk about coming up?
So, I mean, we're now at the point where the really exciting point where we're implementing all these changes. So that's fantastic for us. It does move us on to the next challenge. The initial challenge is kind of planning it, working out what we're doing. Then it's maybe sourcing the trees and things like that. The next challenge for us is proving the business model, because if we can prove the business model, then it's a much easier sell to anyone else that comes around, any other farmers that come around. You can go, yeah, this is it's not, we're not just doing this out of the goodness of our hearts, we are also making enough money for it to be viable, and it doesn't have to, we don't have to go and seek a continuous grants and things like that. So I think that would be my my challenge now, is to try and, in the first instance, sell as many biodiversity units as I need to maintain that aspect of it, which then gives me the breathing space to wait for the nut trees to start producing their nuts. And then it's developing that nut business to make sure that we can sell into local markets and we can explore products and things like that. So yeah, I mean, just a plea to your audience, really. If anybody wants to come and have a conversation with us about that, we are not just a biodiversity net gain operator, we are all these other things, and trying to do all these other things means that we've got loads and loads of potential kind of points of interest for people. So yeah, very happy to have those conversations.
Well, I have a very large corporate following, and I would love to be able to connect you to some of those corporates, because it's something that I truly believe in. And as I say, I think it's so tangible. So I do hope that some people reach out to you. Archie, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your insights. I've learnt so much, which is exactly why I wanted to do this podcast. So I really appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge and experience. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity, and all the work you do at Responsible Futures is utterly amazing. So yeah, happy to support.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good day.